Welcome everybody to episode 6 of Believers and Nonbelievers in Discussion. Today our topic is the role of philosophy and religion in science. I'm going to do a little intro here this time to tell you about the series, just to sort of refresh everybody. What we're trying to do here is, bring my volume down just a bit, please. What we're trying to do with this series is have believers and non-believers, that's theists and atheists, but it's also believers in other things too. Like we had a supernatural panel that had to do with ghosts and Wiccan, for example. And have the two sides sit together and have a conversation. We do not have long-form debate where we basically talk at each other and then the other side ignores that or can only have time to respond to a few points. We really want a conversation going on. And we also want to have the ability to learn to get along, because I think everybody knows by now, as you see these things happen in the media and on YouTube, that there's a lot of discussion, or there's a lot of conclusions that never really get resolved. People's minds don't change, at least in the short term. So a lot of what we have to do, I think, is learn how to coexist. Sometimes it's easier than others. There are some issues are more contentious than others, but the most important thing, I think, is to reduce some of the things that can lead to argument and potentially even violence in the world. So we're trying to learn. We're trying to practice our own skills. We're trying to hopefully model some of that behavior to others, and encourage everybody to have similar conversations in their own lives. And open invitation, if you're anywhere near Riverside, California, to contact me. The group is Believers and Nonbelievers on Facebook. If you want to be on the panel on either side, let me know. We cover many subjects, from religion to philosophy to science. There's just a ton of subjects, ethics, whatever. Okay, so with that, let me introduce today's panel. On my right, we have Todd Bates, professor of philosophy from Cal Baptist University. I'm Phil Calderon from Inland Empire Atheists and Agnostics and Riverside Atheists and Freethinkers. And to my left is Eric Olzols from essentially both groups, also Freethinkers around Redlands, FAR, a third group. And then to his left is Juan Bernal, the vice president of the Orange County Humanists Society.
The Orange County Humanists. Yeah, actually, it's a humanist Orange County.
Okay, and you're active in several philosophy groups over there, I've seen too. So.
I have been in the past, yes.
Okay. So let's start with Todd, I guess. Opening, have at it.
All right. Now, I usually begin the introduction to philosophy class by telling them I have 16 weeks to cover 25 or 2,600 years of material. Okay? And now Phil has kindly but persistently reminded me we have 2 to 5 minutes. So listen quickly. The best place to begin with philosophy is actually the title. It consists of 2 Greek words, one love, one wisdom. So the love of wisdom. Now, the question usually comes up, well, what is wisdom? Well, wisdom, understood from the pre-modern times forward, has been skills in living. So philosophy has always been tied with questions of the best way to live. Okay, so it usually begins with what we might call first-order experiences. Okay, you're just walking through your day and suddenly something strikes you as puzzling. Humans. Why do humans do what they do? I thought I knew that, but I forgot. So how does knowledge work? These are first-order experiences that philosophers want to kind of bracket and step back and take a look at. Now, one of the best ways that they do that is by looking to what others have said about it, but not just anybody. Some of the dominant opinions. So philosophers call this endoxa. Okay, and going back to Aristotle talks about those that are trusted sources. So let me read you what Aristotle says here. He says, endoxa are those opinions accepted by everyone, or by the majority, or by the wise. And among the wise, by all or most of them, or by those who are the most notable and having the highest reputation. Okay, so he narrows it down, but it's what those who are in the know say about those things that puzzle us. And so that helps guide us. Okay? Now, The process of reflection. So when we're inquiring about our experiences, the process of reflection requires two types of questions. So the first we might call content questions, and the second we might call structural questions. So what is believed and why one believes it? So sometimes we'll talk about conditions of possibility. So if somebody holds that humans are just glorified machines, okay, does that help us understand how humans function day to day? So what else must be true? What are the conditions of possibilities for that to be an accurate definition? So we're working in context, not simply content. Okay? Now, in terms of what philosophy is and how it relates to the others, it can be summarized in this way. Philosophy critically examines beliefs and belief systems for consistency and coherence. It deals with conceptual analysis and justification of theoretical frameworks. Okay, so we can almost describe this as internal and external. So it takes a look at the belief system itself and then how that belief system resonates with life. So the internal, external. Okay? Now, science, as I understand it, and all the qualifications duly noted, I am not a scientist. I know a few and can spell it, but other than that, I'm just an observer. Okay, science, or perhaps the sciences, are a diverse array of activities and practices carried on by humans, aimed at understanding, explaining, controlling the natural and the social world. It begins with a set of beliefs and expectations, and then it observes and analyzes in light of those expectations. The observations and analyses are organized into meaningful patterns, a comprehensive explanation toward the purpose of discerning the order that exists between and amongst various bits of data. Okay? Now let me move on to religion quickly. Religion is a set of beliefs together with associated practices that shape forms of life for a person and a community. Beliefs set out the relationship between one's life, the world, and one's place in it. Beliefs tend to be unified by an understanding that there is something real beyond the range of the senses, a transcendent that is worthy of one's deepest devotion. The unified beliefs tend to form a comprehensive narrative that serves as a structure by and through which reality is interpreted and understood. Okay, so if you follow the definitions here, both begin with a certain set of beliefs and then practices associated with those beliefs. And those practices tend to see in the world things that affirm those beliefs. And so we can almost see it as I don't want to say a hermeneutical circle, but a recurring feedback loop. And so if I have practices that call into question my beliefs, then I need to take a look at the practices and the beliefs. Now, this is where the role of philosophy comes in to help both science and religion, because both begin with a framework set of beliefs and then practices associated with those beliefs as it seeks to understand and live out its principles. Okay? 2 to 5 minutes? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
We're we get a little informal here, so we're
Okay, no, very good.
If you just drone on, we'll stop you, but.
All right. Now, do you want me to lay a few quotes out, or do you want me to wait to the discussion?
That's enough to get started. I see some differences already, particularly with expectations. That science starts with expectations. I'm interested in what is true, trying to figure out what is true. So in terms of science and religion and philosophy, these are different. Well, religion is a separate thing, but philosophy and science are sort of methods of attempting to come to truth. So what I kind of want to try to figure out here today is when would be the appropriate time of using one tool versus the other, if you look at them as tool sets. So I don't see it as starting with an expectation. I see it as starting with more of a null position. We don't know this thing, let's look at it and let's figure it out. And then philosophy and science are different tools, and we'll banter that around a bit. The definition of philosophy that I'm just going to throw out there, this is just from the Oxford Dictionary, just to put a foot somewhere in the sand. The study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence, especially when considered as an academic discipline. that's fairly broad. You do get definitions really start to fuzz, and so we have to be careful with our definitions. If we're in a position where we're talking about different things, we'll just clarify that within our conversations. I will agree with you on the science, the expectations. I think for purposes of this, for this conversation, I'm gonna look at science as methodological naturalism, because if you have not philosophical naturalism, not to say that supernatural cannot exist or influence nature, but science can't test it then if it can't. So if that may be the expectation that you're referring to, that an expectation that there is no supernatural. I think if you ask most atheists, you'll find out, to be perfectly honest, that they don't really agree that supernatural can't exist. But okay, I guess that's enough of my position.
All right, thank you guys for coming, the organizers, and my fellow panelists, Todd and Juan, the very attractive audio board personnel we recruited. My name is Eric. I'm going to talk today a little bit about philosophy, and there's several different categories with we can think about this project. First of all, everybody knows somebody they've worked with in the past who picks up every extra shift they can, does as much overtime as they possibly can. This would be like a framework philosophy of somebody who works to live. Their whole life is oriented towards lives to work, my mistake. They live to work. That's their whole goal, is to get as many dollars as they possibly can in their pockets, right? And then you know somebody who's the opposite of the spectrum, who works to live. They like their time off. They want to spend as much time as they can with their families. They take as much time as they can off. They're not looking for extra shift. They work to live, right? This would be a framework philosophy. Okay, so that's one category. This is where you get a lot of your isms like determinism and ableism and so forth. And then another separate set would be your classical contemplative philosophy. This is where you run into Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and Descartes and Kant and so forth, right? Where you're sitting around trying to come up with ideas and think about things in the world, kind of like what Professor Bates was talking about earlier, where you're looking at the world around you and you're trying to come up with ideas about how the world may work. And you're gathering from around you and you're doing the best you can. It's an honest, forthright effort to get the best answer you may have available to you at the time. So amongst this separate group of contemplative philosophy, you can have two separate breakdowns, the way I see it. This is just objective, my own view on this. You can have what I think of as bottom-up philosophy or top-down philosophy. Bottom-up is what you do when you don't have any data, when you don't have any knowledge, right? Science is Latin scientia, knowledge, right? So when you don't have any knowledge, your ancestors were lying around in the savannas of Africa looking up at those twinkling lights in the night sky, contemplating, what are those things up there, right? Well, those people who were around here before, they're gone. They sure seem to have a physical manifestation. Maybe they're manifesting somewhere else, and now they're watching down on top of you. So let's make up stories that those are our ancestors watching down on top of you. And that evolves into, hey, look, those are shaped like a lion for people who were born in the summertime. Let's call those Leos, right? Astrology and so forth. So when you don't have any data, when you have any knowledge, you look around the world best you can, you gather data, and you make up philosophies, you make up theories. And
pull that gain way down on Eric, please. There you go. Yeah, his loud voice.
Trying to modulate my distance. Okay, so sorry, back to the point. So then, as time progresses, you learn more about the world around you, right? You get more data, you get more information. You become smarter, which is a pretty good derogatory term. But as you learn more, you start to come up from your foundations, and you have those knowledge base, right? So you can then use that knowledge that you have in a top-down, irrespective of what's below you, of what you've learned already, and continue to philosophize, continue to theorize about what's in front of you, okay? So I'm going to call the first group in this contemplative subset that I've set up, I'm going to call that regressive philosophy, okay? So if you have knowledge, and you're still making theories, irrespective of that knowledge, you're doing what I call regressive philosophy. And in this case, I'm equating regressive philosophy with bad philosophy. And I don't mean to poke anybody in the chest or throw any grenades, it's just my way of categorizing these things. If you have knowledge, the more knowledge you have, the better theories you can come up with, the more you can learn about the world around you. You're now doing what I call progressive philosophy, or you're doing what I would call good philosophy. This is the armchair, leather patches on the suede blazer with the curved pipe and the big beard and the little spectacles. This is the classics, the Gnostics and the Stoics and so forth. We read about in our one-on-one classes in college. And this is we have a little bit of knowledge, and we're going to use that knowledge and apply it to the world around us as best we possibly can. So there's what I call good philosophy or progressive philosophy, and there's regressive or what I call bad philosophy. You're not helping advance the human project if you're still sitting around philosophizing about things we've already learned, okay? Knowledge, ciencia, so forth, science, right? So once we have that knowledge, please, I think philosophy is great. Continue to do as much as you can, but do it with the base of that knowledge. If you're still sitting around and arguing with people about whether or not humans have descended from common ancestors, or if the Earth is 6,000 years old, Professor, I'm not poking your chest. I don't know what your positions are on the age of the Earth or anything. I'm just talking in generalities here. If you're still sitting around doing that, you are doing what's called regressive philosophy, and you're not helping progress the human project as a whole, as I see it. So I would make a position statement that the only philosophy worth taking seriously, if you hope to advance the human project, is scientifically informed philosophy. And the only reason to engage with bad philosophy is as a didactic, fancy word for learning mechanism, about why it is pernicious, about why it's harmful. It can be very exploratory to learn why people have really bad formal arguments, why people have really bad ideas that don't function in the world around us. And I'll end on a quote because you didn't get yours out. David Hume, the only cure for bad philosophy is good philosophy. The bad will proliferate if good abandons the field. Thank you.
Okay, Juan, go ahead.
I'm Juan Bernal. First of all, excuse myself, I may have to stop and cough a bit. I'm getting over a real bad head cold, and the cough has lingered. And if I get to talking too much and too fast, I'm sure I'll get into a coughing spell. So if I do that, please bear with me. The role of philosophy in religion and science, I had difficulty with this theme or topic. First of all, we're dealing with some very general terms here. Philosophy. I mean, what kind of philosophy? There's so many kinds of philosophy, as Eric began to spell out. Many different philosophers who deal with both religion and science in very different ways. So you kind of have to pick someone or pick some perspective to get a handle on this. Religion, well, religion, same thing. You've got theistic religions. You even have non-theistic religions. You have Christianity, the major religions of the West, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and then a whole gauntlet of all kinds of variations on each. So, which one are you looking at? Science, the same thing. Science is not one thing. Science is many things. There are many forms of science. In all fairness, though, when people bring up this topic, role of philosophy in religion and science, with respect to science, I think they're primarily thinking physics and biology. At least I am, put it that way. With respect to religion, since we're in the West, since most of us are either in a culture that's either Christian or Jewish, and today more and more Islam, we're thinking of those religions generally. So I'll stick to those. I'll give you quickly just some biographical statements of my situation in hoping to bring some of my travel in this area. Before I started studying philosophy, I ran into a book by Walter Kaufmann way back in 1965 when I was first discharged from the Air Force. Walter Kaufmann's book, The Critique of Religion and Philosophy. I found that at the time to be a very, very provocative, enlightening book. And many years later, I hate to count the years, what are we, 50 years later? I still think that. So with regard to religion, I've always considered Walter Kaufmann a great guide. I recommend him. With regard to science, I earned master's degrees and a PhD in philosophy way back in the 1970s. 4, 5, 6 years later, I found myself working as a programmer. It's a logical sequence. You get a PhD in philosophy and you become a programmer. If anyone doubts that, talk to me. And at the time, I ran into a book by a man named Paul Davies. You might be familiar with Paul Davies. He's a professor of theoretical physics, or at least he was. I think he passed away some time ago. Anyway, Paul Davies, the book that I ran into, that I picked up to read just casually, was entitled Other Worlds, A Portrait of Nature in Rebellion, Space, Superspace, and Quantum Universe. I read this book and I was blown away. I didn't have too much of a scientific background in all my studies, and I certainly had not gotten much into the problems and the puzzles of quantum physics, but Paul Davies brought those out in this book, talking about alternative worlds, alternative universes, and all seems to be on the basis of what quantum physics implied or suggested, at least to a number of people like Paul Davies. So again, I'm looking around for people to discuss this with, because it just struck me as out of this world, more science fiction than actual philosophy or science. But here's a well-respected writer telling me otherwise. Later on, we get to the 90s, I picked up a book by a philosopher named Daniel Dennett. This book is titled Darwin's Dangerous Ideas. And I read that book, and again, all of a sudden, I had a new perspective on philosophy as such, because Daniel Dennett spells out the way in which you can build a philosophy of life, of human life, life in general, on the basis of Darwinian natural selection, the theory of natural selection, Darwin's revolutionary theory explaining the evolution of life. So if you like, those were my two books which kind of spell out my entry into trying to deal with areas of science, physics, and biology. What kind of philosophy am I talking about here? Well, maybe it's a very humble, somewhat modest statement of what a person involved in philosophy would be, and it's basically just trying to find my way about, trying to make sense of what I'm reading and seeing. So at least for the time being, I will proceed with that idea of philosophy, just trying to make sense of things, trying to clarify things, trying to find my way about, if you like, without making any claim to coming in touch with truth or anything like that. Just trying to get clear on things.
Okay. I find that last statement interesting because you know, if we're trying to determine what is true, I want to kind of figure out or get some input on how valid philosophy is a tool, when we should use it, what are the limits of the validity of it. Mm-hmm. So let me throw out a question here, and I asked Eric something similar to this the other day, so we'll cover it here. I'm the least knowledgeable about philosophy here, so maybe I'll ask the stupid questions. Is thought experiment philosophy? If we just have a conceptual, trying to figure something out, if we just sit down and try to figure this out with thought only, is that being philosophical?
It can be, and it depends. I guess I would need a little more specifics on what exactly is going on. Just a thought experiment or speculating on things, I wouldn't say that's philosophy. I mean, philosophy certainly involves some degree of discipline, some degree of trying to put things together logically, coherently, rationally, if you like.
Yeah.
And that can be what you're doing when you're indulging or involved in a thought experiment, but it doesn't necessarily true that when you're doing some sort of thought experiment, that's what you're doing. Sometimes you're just waiting for something to come and grab you and waiting for inspiration, if you like. I wouldn't call that philosophy. That's not to say I would degrade it or take away from its value.
Well, if we have philosophy, we have science.
Yes.
It's not. Is it a part of science, or is it just
No.
not even?
No, in my book, philosophy is not a part of science.
Okay.
Philosophy does not discover truth, contrary to what was thought for many, many centuries in traditional philosophy, that somehow the philosopher was discovering a truth of sorts. If you want to know about the world, about nature, you have to go to science. You have to involve a scientific method, research, that whatever we're talking, okay? I don't see that philosophy as such is going to discover truth. If anything, philosophy is going to enable you to clarify what we mean when we talk about what's discovered, say, by the sciences or by anyone else.
Does it get us part of the way toward truth?
It can, of course.
So, Todd, I want to hear your input on this. Thank you.
Yeah, as far as defining philosophy, I think what Juan is getting at is a distinction we would make in almost folk philosophy or kind of a lay philosophy. In one sense, everybody's a philosopher. And so they're trying to make sense of the world. They're trying to piece things together in a reasonable sort of way. But then when we talk about professional philosophy or the discipline itself, so that is more of an academic discipline. Now, I would want to push a little bit more what you mean by truth. There are a variety of definitions of that. To say that philosophy doesn't get at truth, I find somewhat troubling. Now, philosophers do help clarify truth, and so I would not draw a hard and fast distinction between philosophy and science. Indeed, I think every scientist begins with a philosophy. This is why I was amused at the shirt that I was playing. What is the full
Science
shirt
doesn't
say?
care what you believe.
Yeah,
It's
science
Neil
doesn't
deGrasse
care what you
Tyson.
believe. Well, all science is done by humans. And all human thinking begins from somewhere. And so when the scientist steps into the laboratory, he doesn't check his humanity. He can't. And so he brings that to bear on how he does science. Now, what I wanted to read is out of a journal that says a really interesting beginning. Who cares what philosophers say about the difference between psychology and neuroscience or reductionism in general? We are scientists, not philosophers. The answer to this is simple. There is no escape from philosophy. This is, by the way, written by 4 scientists, not philosophers. Okay? Every scientist takes a philosophical position either tacitly or explicitly, whether they state that the result is important, fundamental, or interesting. This is because such assertions are always a judgment from outside of science. There is no interesting variable inherent in the data that can be objectively plotted on a graph. Abstract reasoning and normative claims cannot be substituted by or obtained from data. Tacit awareness is not the same as understanding. Okay, so this idea of tacit awareness, every scientist who does science makes judgment calls. They have to judge which data is important. They have to judge which method is going to yield the kind of data they need to do their research. All of these things are not ad hoc. They're just not for this time and not the other. They are a learned position that they hold that is an expression of those beliefs. Okay? And so I don't know that you can separate. Now, again, the problem with this is that most scientists aren't philosophers, and they don't see what they're doing as philosophy. They're just doing their science. So a cellular biologist is not contemplating the universe. He's doing his cellular biology. And so the conceptual analysis that is necessary is where the philosopher can really be a benefit to help the scientist think better about his conceptual schemes. So this is why when I defined religion and science, they sounded very similar. Right? And so the role that philosophy plays in both is very similar. It deals with conceptual analysis and a measurement of the framework and the product. So does the framework and the method work together? Does what they yield affirm both the method and the framework? So that's a long answer too.
Okay, so a couple points got by me, and I want to make sure I get my little cheese in before we go off on two tangents here. I'm actually going to differ a little bit from what Juan answered to your question, Phil, if philosophy is part of science. And the way I tried to set it up in my opening was, it absolutely is, and there's top down and there's bottom up. This is subjective only. This comes from me. As if you have the data and you're still trying to theorize about what that data can tell you. Let's just say, for example, the periodic table of elements. We understand what the elements are, right? Atoms, protons, neutrons, electrons, so forth. And you have that data, and now you're trying to figure out molecular structures. Well, if you're still worried about whether or not protons and electrons make up the atomic mass of an element, you're now doing regressive philosophy. You're theorizing about something we already know the answer to, and you're no longer advancing the human project. So philosophy is a part of science. I will differ slightly from most of the way Juan answered it. When Todd, you started speaking, you said, and I really like what you said. You said, in one sense, everyone is a philosopher. I agree. I'm going to take that same statement and I'm going to supplement something else. In one sense, everybody's a scientist, broadly defined. When you get in your car and the music doesn't play, what do? You go through diagnostics, right? You start running tests, you start running experiments. You gather data, you know, oh, maybe it's the AM, maybe it's the FM, maybe it's the volume, maybe it's the Bluetooth, maybe the Bluetooth didn't hook up from last time. You start running through that and you learn something, and now you gain, right? And I would say regressive philosophy would be to say, oh, the stereo isn't working. Let's try throwing it outside. We know that's not going to work, right? So if we're still advancing the project by going on what we know, that we call progressive philosophy. And then you mentioned something about, I'll paraphrase, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, some of the presuppositions of how people approach these subjects. And this is where I was talking about earlier, like your framework philosophy about your worldview and your ideas that you bring incumbent to a project that you're going to engage in. And in a way, you're absolutely right. When a scientist enters a lab, and you said it beautifully, when a scientist enters a lab, he can't check his humanity at the door, and there's no way you can avoid that. But the reason I'll add on to your statement there is a little bit of pushback is the scientific method, via the Enlightenment mostly, was so revolutionary and continues to be so revolutionary because it is the one measure of humanity, is the one measure of intellect where we truly try to get as honest as we possibly can by saying, look, I've done as much as I possibly can. I've tried to check as much as my humanity as possible. I've tried to filter that out. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that experiment and I'm going to let my other friend over here, who's an expert in the same field, and he's going to check that out as well. Obviously, I'm not telling you that you don't already know, the peer review process, right? And then somebody else comes along and tries to recreate the same experiment with the same data and the same points, and tries to recreate it and says, oh, you made this mistake, you made that mistake. If you've ever written a really long professional email, I'm talking too fast, sorry. If you've ever written a really long professional email and you read through it 20 or 30 times, you really want your boss to know that he's getting a really good representation of how your mind works in an electronic mail format, right? Even then, you're still going to have somebody check it. Hey, can you read this again? Because invariably, you always put two thes, the, or if, or extra spaces somewhere. You just miss something that because you're reading it the way you wrote it, so you're kind of listening to yourself as you wrote it, and you're reading into eisegesis as opposed to exegesis, but it actually says, that's why we peer review, we let somebody else read it. And if you're really nervous, you can have somebody else read it. The reason the scientific method is so revolutionary is because we said, we're going to get honest about this, and we're going to start letting everybody peer review. And as many people want to peer review the subject and the experiments as possible, the better it's going to be, the more veracity it's going to have, the more validity it's going to have. And I want to present the best ideas I possibly can forward. So I wanted to get my little cheese in there real quick.
Very good. Now, I would want to push back a little bit as though there's this monolithic thing called scientific method.
Agreed. Yeah, we agree.
Scientific methods.
Agreed.
And
yeah.
so to try to say that each particular science operates in the same method.
No.
Well, again, it's those kind of choices that have to be made that aren't determined by the scientific method itself. Okay, so those are the philosophical judgment calls that need to be made. Okay, so right when you begin to get the diversity of scientific systems, sometimes you'll talk about different models in science. So even if we're talking about cellular biology or astrophysics or something like that, there are different models that are taken. Even different models have different methods because of that different model. And so it is not as though there's this monolithic thing called scientific method, okay, that everybody submits to. There are judgment calls that have to be made in how they're going to develop their own methods within each science and then each model within that science. So I guess
with respect to pragmatism, which when it works, right? And when it doesn't work, part of the scientific method is to throw out what didn't work.
Or to keep trying.
Sure, keep trying.
We didn't find enough data. Our
Sure.
data pool wasn't large enough.
Agreed.
So we keep working at it.
Find your errors, fix them, and move on. That's how we advance the human project.
Yeah, now that I think is good. So who do you include in those projects? And so this is where I think the role of the philosopher will never be able to be done away with. And so this is where I think the scientists need the philosophers to come alongside. Juan?
Maybe, yes. I'm a little bothered by the idea that anytime you have a judgment call or you have to make an inference which is not completely supported by the data, you're doing philosophy, or you're making, it's a philosophical judgment call, as you put it. In some cases, yes, in some cases, no. For example, with a lot of what Einstein did in trying to figure out things with respect to, let's say, quantum theory, when he objected to the idea, as he put it, that God plays dice with the universe, he's philosophizing. He's engaging in a certain degree of philosophical reflection. Same thing with Niels Bohr, the famous Danish physicist. Early on, when he and Heisenberg discovered, or what they did with regard to the behavior of subatomic particles and the paradoxes involved, the indeterminism, the uncertainty, a lot of what he wrote and in trying to work out some ideas, some way of grappling with this, I guess you would call philosophy. I don't have any objections to that. But I am bothered by the idea that any time a researcher or a scientist, or even an engineer or a lawyer, has to make a judgment call, he's doing philosophy of sorts. It's kind of like saying if the umpire, when he makes a call, is he out or safe at home plate? He has to make a judgment call because he's not quite sure. He didn't quite catch whether, in fact, the catcher tagged the runner out before the runner's foot hit home plate. He had to make a judgment call. Is he doing philosophy? No, he made a judgment call. It's required in the job of being umpire.
Subjectivity.
I think sometimes we're a little too loose in what we classify or designate as philosophy.
Can I, on this subject of presuppositions and checking your humanity at the door, I'm gonna bait the hook and throw it out there at you. Okay, when you signed up to be a professor at Cal Baptist, did you sign a statement of faith?
Yes.
Okay, and can you elaborate a little bit on what that said? Would you be willing to?
In terms of what?
In terms of what you're willing, of the presuppositions you're going to take to your research and your instruction, your academia.
Sure.
Could you elucidate a little on that?
Well, it is not so much an impingement on our research.
Okay.
So we have commitments that shape how we understand research, how we understand
hermeneutical
focus.
interpretation.
Yeah, that's
sure.
right. So hermeneutics is a very good term to use.
Cool.
Can you guys define that for me? Because I don't know
The art of interpretation.
I think it's not exclusively, but it's usually reserved for biblical interpretation or religious scriptural interpretation.
Yeah. Well, I understand all
Historically.
Well, I understand all philosophy as being hermeneutical.
Sure, but I think the term was originally reserved for religious
specifically.
Yeah.
Law.
Yeah, of course,
well,
sure. So, and the reason I ask is because we always hear these grenades lobbed about presuppositions and checking humanity at the door, and I really like the way you phrase that. Well, when someone at Azusa Pacific or CBU signs a statement of faith, they are broadcasting their presuppositions. They're broadcasting their intent to interpret all data in a biblical worldview or whatever the statement of faith may be. I will go out on a limb, and I don't have fancy scientific degrees from fancy universities. Like my degree doesn't relate. It is scientific, but not that way. You don't sign a statement of philosophical naturalism when you agree to do an internship or agree to do a professorship or agree to get a doctorate degree in any sort of hard science or soft science. You don't do that. And the only time we ever see those statements of faith are when you're going to go work for Answers in Genesis or Institute for Creation Research. And I don't need to poke you in the chest. That's not my intention. But these accusations are always lobbed by people who have signed statements of faith, who have signed statements of intention to skew the data, maybe an inappropriate term, but that's kind of the way I see it.
Right.
Right or wrong.
That's a good point. Yeah, both very good points. One with the baseball analogy. I like that. So let me take these in order. Yes, but if the umpire recognizes he's in this game, so there are some rules that are applied in that game. Okay, but the very fact that he steps into that game, he already knows he is playing this kind of game by these kind of rules.
Okay.
And so that guides his judgment. But let's remove the umpire from the baseball field and put him in life.
Where?
Okay? Put him in life.
In life.
So an argument with his wife. So is he going to call her out? Probably not likely. Okay? Or he will be kicked out. He'll be thrown out of his ear. So there are personal judgment calls that he has to make in life that aren't instructed by the nature of the game. Okay, does that make sense? So when you enter into baseball, you accept the constructs that run the game of baseball.
Yes.
Okay, so the judgment calls are impinged on those rules. But when you step out of that language game, that particular game structure, into life, you don't have those.
I would
Okay.
object.
Fill in calling her out. I don't know what that
I
means.
was trying to be humorous. Stay with the metaphor.
Yeah.
But if you
I
have
got
a
it. I
disagreement
liked
with
it.
your wife, yeah. Right. So if you have a disagreement with your wife,
Okay.
and you want to say your wife is wrong, it would be
Right.
like calling her out. Well,
Yeah.
that's a judgment call that is not determined by the structure of the game.
Okay.
Okay. Now that is not to say that there aren't structures we abide
Social
by.
structure,
Right,
yeah,
right.
constructs.
Social right.
Right.
Constructs that we use. So being married means that I treat my wife in certain ways.
Right.
Okay. So the decisions I make need to be consistent with those.
Okay.
But it's not quite as structured. So making the judgment in life is not the same as making the judgment in a game of baseball.
Maybe not.
Does that make
It's
sense?
more dynamic, more fluid, but
Right.
there's still a structure to it.
So there's a structure, but I have to make judgment calls on which one is going to play a key role in this decision. Okay, so when I say that it's the judgment involves one's ideas of right and wrong, good and bad, appropriate, inappropriate. So all of those things come into play in every decision that is made, every judgment that is made.
Yes and no, maybe. I just don't know how this gets at the at an answer to the question. Is this a case of the guy doing philosophy or engaging in philosophy? I just don't see it.
By philosophy, the average Joe on the street, I'm not talking about a professional philosopher.
No, I understand.
So we're using the folk philosophy, but someone in the laboratory. Right? So they have to make a judgment call on what is likely to be real or not. Actually, as we were talking, I'll get back. I need to write a note, not to forget what I wanted to talk with Eric about.
It's a compliment on my hair.
I think I've already done it. So I've already forgotten it. So let me read a quote by Stephen Jay Gould that may kind of drive this home. The preceding sentence says something like this: while science attains objectivity through continuous assessment and scrutiny and reproducing results, individual scientists are not necessarily objective. Okay, so this goes back to Eric's comment that you have this peer review process, okay, that helps narrow it down. And so while science attains objectivity, the scientists not necessarily. Okay, now let me go into Stephen Jay Gould's comment. We scientists are no different from anyone else. We are passionate human beings, enmeshed in a web of personal and social circumstances. Our field does recognize canons of procedure designed to give nature the long shot of asserting herself in the face of such biases. But unless scientists understand their hopes and engage in vigorous self-scrutiny, they will not be able to sort out unacknowledged preferences from nature's weak and imperfect message.
But this is why we use consensus, because it's a correcting mechanism.
Sure, that's right.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of consensus, are there certain unwritten statements of faith that guide appropriate and inappropriate expressions of scientific discovery? So this is Eric, this is kind of the response. So if you are a climate biologist today, environmental scientist, and you discover material that is against global warming, you have virtually no hope of getting published.
Or you have a lot of money coming to your bank account, because if you can overturn a well-established theory, almost any one of them, you're going to reach fame and fortune
See,
in
this
very
is-
short order.
Well, this is the problem, that it may not be well established if the competing voices are shut out.
Well,
Also,
Hang
okay,
on.
sure.
What I want to push back on is that the assumption that somehow when a Christian context signs a statement of faith, that our biases are somehow more than other environments. So what I would say is that's actually a strength. We set it out up front. This is who we are. This is what these are our defining principles. Okay? Every science has a procedure. Every science has this embedded recognition of what is viable and what is not. And what Gould is getting at, I think, is look, science could learn something from a Christian context that sets out its presuppositions. These are our assumptions. This is where we begin. This guides us. Well, is a cellular biologist not making...
No, because you are adding a bias. You are starting with a position of, here is a bias. Every conclusion that I come to has to then be compared to that original statement.
Mm-hmm.
And that the original statement may not be true. That's the problem with presuppositional positions, putting that into the mix.
See, here's where
it's the difference of saying, it's the difference of starting out saying, this is true, or saying, is this true?
Yes,
That's
exactly.
the difference.
Well, you do not necessarily have science beginning, is this true? So they begin with a certain set of assumptions that they accept as true.
Methodological naturalism,
Right.
Sure.
That's right, just as we talked about.
Yes.
So that is a commitment. There's nothing in science that demands this commitment.
Methodological naturalism is not the commitment. The commitment is philosophical naturalism. That's when you say, I'm only going to get this result. That's when you predetermine the result. Methodological naturalism is when you say, I'm only going to account for things I can measure. I'm only going to account for things I can account for, and somebody else can come along after me and reproduce those results.
But see, this is the point, that there's nothing in the data itself that demands that particular reading. It's the judgment call of the scientist that's got to piece the data together in this way. So he's making judgment calls at what he pulls out. And so if he is influenced by certain assumptions about the nature of things, that's what they're going to see.
I agree with you, and I feel like we've kind of circled the same target. We dropped a couple bombs already, and I'm going to go back to what I said before, and I don't want to repeat myself, but that's why the scientific method is so revolutionary, because we are always going to have our biases. You're always going to read your email and not see the when it actually says the. That's why we take that work and we say, hey, I've cleared out as many of my biases as I possibly can. We hand it to our friend who's an expert in the field, and you say, can you please check this over as well? And then they'll hand it over to, a physicist will hand it over to a chemist will hand it over to whoever else, so whoever the scientist was says, all of science is physics, the rest of it's just stamp collecting, right? But that's what the scientific method is so impactful, and it's taught us so much about the world. I'm sorry to cut you off.
Well, I'm wondering here. Naturalism, okay. That science is methodological naturalism, because if you have something that's supernatural that does not cause evidence, you can't really prove it. You can have it conceptually there as an evaluation or as a possibility, but you can never really show it. So you leave it there as an intellectual concept, as a possibility. Science does exclude non-natural things from a methodological point of view because it cannot test these things. So it doesn't. That's why I'm saying. That's why I think it's a little too far to say that it's a bias up front. It is a recognition that it can't prove something that might be there. So then the question to me becomes, if there's something there that is causing a result in an experiment that we're doing that science can't see, how do we know? Can we tell that's different? How can we differentiate that from nothing being there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, we run it by me one more time. So I'm not.
Okay. If you run an experiment, let's just say the origin of the universe, kind of a thing. We don't know what came before, right? So and one of the possibilities is a supernatural deity, intelligent design, kind of a thing. Another would be something related to current physics. Another could be something just totally unknown to us currently. So if a supernatural element, by definition, is unmeasurable, how do we evaluate the likelihood of it being there? And how do we separate that likelihood from it being non-existent?
Sure. So this is where I think philosophy and the idea of conceptual analysis, the conditions of possibility. Okay, so if you begin with the origin of the universe, say you have the material stuff. Okay, so where does that stuff come from? So what are the conditions of possibility that make certain answers better than others? Okay, so when you're dealing with that conceptual analysis, you're dealing with something beyond what science really can give you. Okay?
Yeah.
So one has to make choices as to what they're going to see as that appropriate condition of possibility that makes sense of this particular science. Okay?
How do you make the choice then?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And that's why we have so many competing expressions of it. So that's where we're different.
So then the choice becomes a preference then?
This is where you work out pragmatically. So I am not a pragmatist in terms of truth, but if something is true, it should work. Okay? So if you have a principle and you put it into practice, okay, and it doesn't yield what it should, then you've got a problem either with practice or principle. And so you step back and you take a look at it. Now, to me, this is just how science has moved forward. Mm-hmm. So you have this competing explanations of things, and some get set aside, and some get pursued. And the reason it's set aside or pursued cannot be justified by the stuff itself, the data itself. Okay? That's a conceptual choice. Or, if we want to call it that, a biases.
Well, are you biased to think that gravity doesn't apply to you if you climb to the top of the building? No, you're compelled to think that based upon a lifetime of evidence of throwing things away from the center of the Earth, and they always get attracted back at 9.8 meters per second squared, right? So if you climb to the top of the building, you're not making a conscious choice to interpret that data as dropping your phone off and as it blows up. You follow me?
Yeah.
I think it sounds like that's what you're saying.
Well, you kind of grow up into, this is what philosophers call background beliefs.
Sure,
Okay.
or not pretenses.
Presuppositions.
No, it's a Sean Carroll term. It escaped me. I'll come back.
So the background beliefs are things we grow up believing, and they often operate at the level of the unconscious, and so they're always a part of our thinking. As a matter of fact, Foucault would call it the unthought. So one of the philosophers describes it as the unthought. So it's stuff that is so part of our thinking we don't even think about it. So gravity would be one of those kind of
intuitive,
things. Right.
yeah.
So well, yeah, it's a little more than that.
But you're compelled to accept the accuracy of the gravitational model, right? You're not choosing to one way or the other.
Well, here's something maybe applied to science. So the theory, Einstein's gravitational theory. So we would say that the universe would slow in its expansion.
Time is relative to the observer.
Because of the gravitational pull. But the Hubble telescope, so that's a commitment that we've made, and that's how we've understood it until the Hubble spacecraft goes, and it says, well, it's not slowing down, it's actually accelerating. So here's where you step back and you think, okay, what did we miss? Right, so the reason you recognize that your concepts, your biases, have created a situation where your expectations weren't met. Okay, you follow?
Well, no, I disagree. That it's in that example, it's not a bias. It is an incorrect
interpretation of the observation.
You know, you did an experiment with a certain expectation. You built this telescope. You found something different. Mm-hmm. That's not a bias. That is a result that you then have to deal with. You're missing variables. Your assumption was incorrect. Something like that.
So it kicks you back.
It kicks you back.
Well,
but that's not a bias.
Well, it is. It's your expectation. Okay, so I think you're understanding biases almost wholly negatively, but I don't know that it necessarily.
I think it's the wrong word. I mean, your expectation is the hypothesis, the source of the hypothesis, the source of the original hypothesis mm-hmm. that you based your experimentation on. Correct.
Okay. One more time.
Okay. You had an idea,
mm-hmm.
and you created a hypothesis based on that idea. You then built an experimental item, the telescope in this case, to measure the expansion of the universe. Is it expanding? Is it not expanding? Is it contracting? You then your hypothesis said, for example, that it was not expanding. You then found a different result than you expected. That does tell you to go back because you either missed something or your hypothesis was incorrect. There's unaccounted for variables. I don't see that bias as being the right word in there.
Yeah, well, maybe it's not. Maybe we're working on a different. I understand bias is maybe a little broader. So the beginning expectations narrow what you're looking for. Okay. Now here's the positive side of it, because it's that very biases, that very expectation that allows you to see otherwise. Okay.
Well, it narrows what you. I don't agree that it narrows what you're looking for. I mean, you're looking to confirm your hypothesis. If you find something different, if you have a negative result, that is a very, very valuable result in science.
Indeed.
That is not the result of a bias.
You get more points for proving yourself wrong.
We learned that that space does not have ether. This is one of the most famous negative result experiments.
Right.
The Michelson-Morley experiment. There's no bias involved there. We thought it worked this way. We did an experiment. We found out it didn't. So then we had to go back and figure out, well, what did we miss? There's another method, and you see this a lot in cosmology where something doesn't work out. They go back to the drawing board, basically come up with more hypotheses.
Okay, so let me kind of draw this back to the original question. The idea that religion somehow has a preconceived biases.
Closer.
Oh, I'm sorry. So that religion somehow has a preconceived biases that, say, a science does not. Okay, so if you're working through, say, something like a good understanding of forgiveness, and so you have one guy that says this is how it works, and so then you interact with human beings and you see this negative feedback. It doesn't seem
forgiveness between people or between.
Yes, let's just go with people.
Between
right now,
people, okay.
Between people. And so you have this certain understanding of forgiveness, say, given to only those who deserve it. Okay? And so you practice that for a while, and it doesn't seem to do anything. It actually creates negative feedback. So at that point, you come back and you rethink your expectations. You rethink your principles. You rethink your beliefs in this area. And then you come, so that's a very similar way in which science works. Okay? You begin with certain assumptions, certain expectations, and you go out and move outward in that, and you see your experiences generate puzzles that your current way of understanding things can't answer. Okay?
Well, that is a social science, right?
Yeah, it could be.
I mean, it is. I mean, that's the social interaction of symbiotic social species that have, mutually assured, expansion and destruction. Right?
Well, if you want to define religion simply as a social.
No. I mean, earlier you were saying forgiveness. You can go out and test that model against. Right. I mean, that is a social. There's a lot of ground has been tread there.
Well, I don't know that we would say it's testing so much.
Well, isn't that what you're doing when you're testing out your forgiveness model on other people and seeing whether or not they respond?
This is where I don't know that I would want to over-scienticize.
I like you making up words. I like that.
That's right.
I do it too.
I'm a philosopher. I get to. So if I can't find something that fits, I'd create it.
Okay, so
I don't know that I would want to do that as an experiment, because I'm going to test how this model of forgiveness works.
Experiment tests is semantics. I mean, it's
but
you're still testing it against the world around you and the people around, and then the mutual minds that occupy the space with you, right?
Yeah, but the intentionality, I guess, so the falsifiability that tends to be associated with kind of a
soft sciences.
Well, even an experiment.
Sure.
So you do your experiment and you look for reasons why it won't work. Well, I don't know that it's somebody who wants to believe forgiveness is a good way to live begins with that kind of model. Okay.
Prior credences, yeah.
Yeah, so they don't begin looking for falsifiability. They believe it until they find it not working. Okay, does that make sense?
I take issue with several of the words you're using and the way you use them, but on your own merit,
right.
Yes, we'll grant for sake of argument.
Okay,
for sake of argument, yeah.
Right. So when I have a belief that it's better to forgive, but I have an errant understanding of what forgiveness is, I don't know that it's errant until I actually get out and practice it. Okay, but I don't begin by assuming a falsifiability.
Okay. So
That does sound like a very scientific structure. I mean,
Well, it may be.
you have a hypothesis that forgiveness is a good thing. You then go do an experiment to test it.
Well, here's where it's
And then
the
there was
hypothesis.
the result.
Well, actually, you're affirming the point I want to make, that science and religion really have a lot of close similarities.
well, science came from religion. I mean, it was natural philosophy, and it gave birth to the scientific method, and now
Right.
with whether or not they're
So how I might describe it is that both are expressions of faith-seeking understanding.
depends on how you're using the word faith, of course.
Okay? Accepting certain things to be true, and then moving out and living as though they are true.
Is that how you're using faith?
Okay? In this sense, yes.
Okay.
Okay? It's a complex word.
Trust and religious people without evidence, and
Yeah. So
Yeah.
when you trust your scientific assumptions, okay, that when I look at this place at this time, I'm going to see that. Okay, well, you don't know that ahead of time. Okay, you hypothesize. You extend. It should work this way if this is true. So you believe that it is true, and then you go see if it's validated.
No, you don't believe that it's true.
Yeah, you don't
That,
believe.
your belief hasn't been formed yet.
You
The expectation
see,
is there.
this is where I think
This-
you're
I think-
viewing the scientist as kind of this heroic, objective.
No, I think this is very interesting because I think this is one of the major differences in interpretation between a theist and a non-theist, if you will. That, in science, you are trying to figure something out. So you have a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a really weak position. It is based on a concept of something. You then come up, the hypothesis is basically the explanation, and then you figure out how to test it. You don't believe it. You want to go find out if it's true, if it's real. If you take a hypothesis past that, if you promote it, and this is why something like creationism, we teach the controversy in school, I think is extremely incorrect, because creationism is basically a hypothesis. So, you can't really take it beyond that. You don't go teach that to every student in high school. You do testing and you figure it out only when it becomes a dominant consensus theory.
Demonstrable.
Then you teach it to others. So I see this, the belief comes after the experimental results.
See, I don't think it does.
And-
I think every scientist forms a hypothesis based on the beliefs that he already has about the way that things work.
How much confidence, and you use the word faith or confidence interchangeably, it's fine with me. How much confidence do you think a person has at that point of hypothesis, in your opinion?
Well, if they're going to invest their research, their time, their money, and effort in it, they have to believe that it's going to yield positive results.
To what degree? Give me a number between 1 and 100. I mean, seriously, just.
I have
It
no
depends
idea.
on the discipline.
And it may.
I mean,
depend
is
on the
it
person.
like I'm 90% sure this is true, or does 51 qualify you, or does 49 not qualify you?
Well, why do they make the choice to pursue that hypothesis as opposed to another?
Because that's the way the data represents itself. That's the way it points.
And so they believe that this is going to yield results. So again, it's that judgment call that is inseparable from one's understanding, one's belief about the way things are.
And they want to test that idea. I wouldn't say belief. They want to test that idea against the dictates of reality and see if it actually pans out.
And if the
And then we
hypothesis-
do the best we can to get as objective as we can back to the scientific method and emails and so forth.
Yeah, so if they realize that hypothesis doesn't yield, they don't jettison their whole belief system.
Well,
They
no,
just
that's
think-
why I say top down versus bottom up. You're right. They don't jettison what we already know. They formulate a new hypothesis. They say, well, it didn't work that way, so maybe it'll work this way.
Now, how closely related is that hypothesis to the belief system that generated the first
Well,
hypothesis?
I think we're taking on face value that it is a belief system. I don't agree that it is a belief system in the first
Well,
place.
it's certainly a framework of beliefs. So,
Again, the word beliefs is I object.
By belief, you only mean affirmation. Then
What
yes.
you have accepted as true. It's your acceptance of truth is not related to what actually is true.
sure.
Right? Well, that's what a belief is what you accept as true. So
But
you can think, you can have an idea, and then you test that idea against the dictates of
You
reality.
can have a hope that it's true.
Exactly, yeah.
Professor Higgs, who theorized the Higgs boson particle, certainly hoped his theory or hypothesis was correct. He didn't really I'm going to speculate a bit here, that he wouldn't really believe it until it was experimentally proven. And,
It just seems to me that you're trying to protect the scientist.
No.
Yeah, it does.
No, what I'm
willing
trying
to accept the beliefs of the scientist shapes the hypothesis.
I think you're superimposing
what
those
I'm trying
beliefs
to do,
on, yeah.
what I'm trying to do is prevent an extrapolation beyond what is justified.
Fair.
And I think that you are not justified in having a belief until you have the experimental result.
See, I think that gets it backwards. So I think, I really do. I think we've kind of hit the nutshell.
It sounds like we've hit
Right.
the base here.
That's right.
I've dug about as deep as we can go, and I think that's a difference, and that's kind of the whole point of the exercise is to
Yeah.
find differences and expose those and kind of
Yeah, that's interesting.
roll around the mayflow a little bit.
Well, the whole idea of the scientist being human, I think directly informs how they approach their hypothesis, how they approach their whole take on the science of what they're doing in the laboratory.
And that's why they peer review, and that's why they get as objective as they possibly can, and they try to prove themselves wrong. So can I propose that we just take the next hurdle and jump over? I want to go back, and you said something I really wanted to entertain here for a little while. You were talking about the expansion of the universe and the Hubble, and we thought it was steady state, and then we thought it was decreasing just based upon suppositions, and then we learned from Hubble it was expanding, and we went back and changed the scientific model, went back and changed our understanding, and mea culpa, our bad, we made a mistake. I'm curious, from a Protestant perspective, when has religion specifically, and the religion is a big umbrella term,
Right.
when have you guys done that? When have you guys mea culpa and said, oh, wait, we made a mistake? Like for example, the Vatican in 91 said, oh, sorry, Galileo, our bad, even though it was
Right.
Bruno and Copernicus and so forth. And then the same thing with, you hear, I'm going to make up a number here, 95% of Protestants that I walk around in every day, they're not skeptical of common speciation or common descent, that sort of thing. So what has religion learned? Because when your texts are divinely inspired, they can't really be modified without somebody saying, wait a minute, it used to say this, and now it says this. You can't take out the part about talking donkeys. You can't take out the part about the sun standing still in the sky for 3 hours so Joshua could win a battle. You can't take those parts out. We've learned those things are functionally impossible. So when has Protestant Christianity specifically mea culpa in the same way that cosmology did with the steady state versus the expanding universe?
Well, the very term that you use is Protestant. We're celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation.
Congratulations.
Yeah, I think that was we're not doing it well. Now, most Protestants, I think, recognize there's a difference between, I use the term interpretation. So there's a difference between the text and how we understand the text. And so there's a process that we go through that is very, very similar to what you talked about in terms of the community of science. So we will take an interpretation, and then we will check those interpretations by others in history. So the endoxa of Aristotle is how theology develops, how proper hermeneutics develop. And so if somebody gets cold on it, they can't justify it, they set it aside. But it doesn't change that fundamental belief. Okay? So again, this is where I see a lot of parallels between science and how it functions and Christianity and how it functions, or theism.
So do you, specifically the question, do you have an example of when you guys have modified your preaching? When the message has been modified, when we've learned more? Because that's what your model of the Hubble, versus steady state. Do you have examples of when?
Well, the Protestant Reformation, so indulgences.
Oh, so Martin Luther specifically, Calvinism. Okay,
yeah, that's right. And so there's a sense in which there is a recognition that the practice that we are involved with doesn't match the text, and so our ways of understanding it need to change. And so they step back and retool in pretty significant ways how we understood it.
So you have the presupposition there that the text is correct,
Right.
and that you're working with the wrong interpretation.
well,
Right.
the Vatican had been working with the wrong interpretation for 1,200 years or whatever it was.
I don't even know what it means to say the text is correct.
Yeah, that's-
independently of interpretation.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, spell that out
It's a
for me.
valid point. Yes.
So specifically, if Martin Luther figured out that the church was selling vices, and we know the whole story, the nailing, it's a cool story.
Indulgences.
Specifically, he figured it out, right? And they had been fully convinced they were doing it the right way for 1,200 years, right? Martin Luther comes along and Calvin and so forth. They come along like, hold on a second, time out, we've been doing this all wrong. And they go back and do it again. How do you know that right now you're not in the same position that they were 10 years before the Reformation? Right now, you could be misinterpreting the text, right? And in a couple of years, we could learn something spectacular, and you say, oh, wait a minute, oh, no, I've been reading that all wrong. How do you know you're not in that state right now?
Right. Well, you really can't, any more than a scientist pre-Galilean knows.
Copernican, to be fair. Yeah.
Copernican.
He stole Copernicus' ideas. Yeah, he was just louder and more obnoxious about it. That's why he gets all the press. But yeah,
Right. I won't pick that point. I just let that go. So you have moments like that in science. All right. So prior to Copernicus, there was a sense of the way in which science was done, and then all of a sudden there's a realization. Maybe this isn't it. And so I don't know prior to that discovery whether you can. I don't know how you could know that you're wrong. So you're right. We could be on the cusp of another Reformation, but we don't know prior to that. And so just like science doesn't know. Okay. So the uncertainty principle. Is that a mark of our own inability, or does that put us on the cuff of recognizing a whole other way of doing?
Well, when you say the uncertainty principle, I'm assuming you're talking about Heisenberg's.
Yeah.
Okay, this often gets conflated. There are people, and this is a little hobby horse of mine. People think, and I'm not putting words in your mouth. The Heisenberg principle of uncertainty is a bowl of soup is a certain temperature. You want to figure out what temperature it is. You're going to take a thermometer and stick it in the bowl of soup, right? Well, the thermometer comes in with a pre-temperature. You're going to change the temperature of the soup to measure it. That's what a lot of people think the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty is. I don't know if you're saying that's what it is. It's not. It's saying that specifically a particle, a subatomic particle, the more you know about its momentum, the less you know about its position. The more you know about its position, the less you know about its momentum, specifically. So this is a shortcoming of subatomic particle physics, not a shortcoming of the scientific method, right? I don't know if that's how you're using that.
Yeah, so the very fact that this method yields the dilemma, we don't know whether it's getting at something fundamental to the nature of quantum physics, or whether it is a problem of method. Okay?
Well, but in science, the information is cumulative. You know, you're right. You go back 400 years, and things were very unreliable. You know, what turned out to be true. I mean, I always say that the scientific method is the best route we have to what is most likely true at any point in time. But it's a much tighter road than it used to be. So,
well, what I think I'm trying to get at is we could be on the cusp of another Copernican type revolution, but we don't know it this side of things.
yes.
So the same thing would be true. How do I know that we're not headed to another
But that
reformation?
doesn't imply that the science is likely to be false as true, especially as we go forward more in time and collect more science,
Right.
and that we have seen a pattern of science proving this true, in Mendelian physics, DNA.
Sure.
As you go on over time, it's the deviations are smaller and smaller. Not that paradigm shifts can't happen. We always leave that possibility.
Well, there are paradigm shifts, but the pre-Copernican, post-Copernican,
Right.
that's more than just a paradigm shift. I mean, that's a game changer.
Right, but this is what I see a lot in religious arguments, though, and which kind of is one of my pet peeves. Then is I see science being criticized, and then as unreliable because it could always be false, which anybody will tell you. I mean, Lawrence Krauss says this all the time, very cleanly. But then the examples that are pulled out are like Galileo and stuff. And we're not in that situation.
Sure.
I know we don't know what we don't know.
I get your.
It's just the only thing is I'll throw it. I want you to get your point out, but it's been a unilateral one-way street. Every time there's been a Copernican or a Galilean or a Darwin revolution, a reformation, if you will use the term, it's always favored operational, epistemological, natural processes. It's never favored a supernatural process. The Bible has never been proven right through this process. We started out with Copernicus and Galileo. We learned about heliocentrism versus geocentrism, and then we learned Darwin and common descent, and then we went to Einstein and we learned about relativity and cosmology, and we're still learning in a theoretical sense. It's always been a one-way street. So to sit at the end of that street and to look back at all that's happened so far and go, man, look at all we've learned. Every time there's been a reformation, we've gone further down the street, never gone backwards.
Right.
What would instill in you to say, well, it still could be my religious beliefs, or it still could be as a result of original sin? Do you follow what I'm saying? I may have not phrased that perfectly.
Not entirely. I'm not sure I'm getting the point of your question. So, all right. So I don't look to science. If science really does assume this methodological naturalism, then science will only yield material answers to material questions. You cannot expect science to yield any questions about transcendence.
If transcendence is a coherent concept, if it exists.
But see, now this is the philosophical question.
Well, science uses methodological. It does not, but philosophical still is open to it. It just can't work in that.
I'm actually granting you the point.
Okay.
Your metaphysical naturalism.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Methodological
naturalism.
Yeah.
I'm granting you that. I think that's right. I think that science does operate in that way. So this is the material stuff. We're going to break the material stuff apart. We're going to see what the material stuff does, and then we're going to step over here and find the same material stuff and break it apart in the same way to see if we find the same thing. Now, if that is how science works, we shouldn't expect transcendent answers.
Correct.
Okay.
Given that we can spell out what we would mean by a transcendent answer coherently and clearly. I mean, has anyone ever done that other than within a certain scheme of doctrine and philosophy, if you like?
All right, so now here, okay, very good point. So what science yields here is focused on matter. So we should not expect the scientific principles to yield principles of transcendence.
But that's what I'm questioning. I'm not even sure that makes sense if you really probe it. I mean, we're working here with concepts and language, and I think you're stretching it. Whenever people speak of transcendence and the supernatural, I think what it comes down to is just metaphorical talk, really. I think in the end you're limited to what we have insofar as concepts, language, and how we apply those concepts in what we say, and to the extent to which it's clear and coherent. I don't think a lot of this talk about transcendence is clear and coherent.
What can you offer up as an example of how we can interact with, or how we can know that transcendence has manifested? How if transcendence exists, how can I interact with it?
So, you're kind of missing the point of what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
Is in terms of science itself, it cannot definitively yield God exists, God does not exist.
Oh, I strongly disagree.
Okay.
I vehemently disagree, but I'll let you finish your point.
I don't know how you could, because if it is methodological naturalism, it's dealing with natural things.
Let me ask you this. If you're skeptical of the existence of rabbits, and I hand you a rabbit, have I just demonstrated the existence of a rabbit? Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm skeptical of the existence of Yeshua of Nazareth. Mm-hmm. In your belief system, Yeshua of Nazareth has manifested himself on this planet a finite number of years ago, right? In certain, different ways of saying the same thing, two sides of the same coin. In certain belief systems, I'm not saying yours, the Shroud of Turin, parts of the True Cross that are all over Europe, those are manifestations of that, right? And we can test that. We can test that against the dictates of reality, right? So you just say science can't prove God exists. The only things that science cannot prove exist are things that don't exist. If it exists, I can show it to you. I can demonstrate it to you, right?
Now here is where you lapsed from methodological into metaphysical naturalism.
I think you're saying philosophical.
No, metaphysical naturalism.
I don't accept existence of metaphysics, and I think metaphysics is purely conceptual.
All right. Well, it is. So you have.
Well, then thanks for admitting it doesn't exist.
Well, see, now I don't accept your assumption here.
Fair.
Okay? I don't think that just because I can't put it under a microscope, it doesn't exist.
Well, there's different ways things exist, right? Love. We'll both agree that love exists. The love you have for your son, it's his birthday. Happy birthday, Todd's son, okay? The love you have for your son, right? No doubt, this exists. I'm not skeptical of that. Right. Music, the example here all the time is music. But there are different ways things exist, right? Mm-hmm. So music, love, depends on minds. Where does music exist where there is no mind? Where does love exist where there is no mind, right? What is the mind? I maintain, we probably differ, but I maintain the mind is what the brain does, just like Oregon Trail is what a Mac 2 does, right, when you stick the disk in. Oregon Trail is the program, the mind is the program, the brain is running. It still depends upon the physical, and I hate to sound like a scientismist or a metaphysical naturalist, that may be an apropos challenge. But I would maintain that these things that we say exist, they exist as concepts. Music exists as a concept. The difference between music and a car alarm. There's still noises, there's still vibrations, they still require a disturbance, a medium, and then a receiver, and then an interpreter, right? So the difference between music and a car alarm is relative to the mind. We label that, right? The difference between love and hate is cognitive, it's conceptual, we understand that. So I'm not saying love doesn't exist, I'm not saying the metaphysics don't exist, but they exist as concepts, and concepts depend upon minds, minds depend upon brains. To be a reductionist, and then you can say brains are molecules, and molecules are atoms, and atoms are protons, neutrons. I can do this all day.
Right. So you get the reductionism.
Yeah.
Right, and that's what I would reject. I don't think that is an accurate depiction. So is there such thing as a consciousness without the neural processes? So is there a self that transcends the sheer material stuff? This may be a topic for another.
No, it's okay.
Are you saying these are significant questions that shouldn't be examined themselves? I mean, we don't start with a question like, why is there something rather than nothing, and just go from there as if it were text that we work from, as Heidegger did. I think an important part of philosophy or philosophical criticism is to look at the question itself. And that's what I would do with the two questions that you just posed. I mean, one of them had to do with the question of consciousness itself, what'd you say, independently of the physical or something like that? Mm-hmm. I really would like to examine that question and see how far one could push it.
Work is being done. Yeah. And I'll happily admit I can't explain abiogenesis or the origin of consciousness or the question, all the different phrased questions about Big Bang.
Let me just throw out one little thing here is that when we know the science of the brain to the degree that we know it currently, and you're saying consciousness exists and you are interpreting this as a transcendent quality?
No, not necessarily. I was just challenging the assumption that everything could be reduced to matter.
Now, okay,
not exactly
so what I really want to say here is that we don't know currently. We don't know what consciousness is. There is certainly research on it. We know we have better hypotheses than we did have, say, 30 years ago. Those hypotheses may all be very bad. They may be bad ideas. That's why I don't say that, going back to the belief thing, I wouldn't say people believe in them, but at least that's the best I can come up with so far. But to jump that consciousness is transcendent as the likely answer does two things. That number one, it stops the questioning, and number two, it leaves out the possibility that it may not be transcendent. Right. And I think that's one of the problems I see in religion a lot is that when you get to an answer like or a position like love is transcendent, God exists, that kind of stops, and and people, especially when they want to be there, like for example, we would want to have life after death. They stop questioning, and it may not be the correct position. Right. You're losing that ability, and then you really do have a strong bias against looking further.
I wasn't really trying to state a position. I was just trying to raise a question to the position as stated. So I would hold that. I'm not even quite sure how we got here. The original question that we started wrestling with. It made sense at the time.
Yeah, we do that a lot here. This is why we kind of learn as we go in this panel.
The role of philosophy and science and religion.
You were conceding that all gods are fiction. If you'll continue with that point.
No. Here's yeah. So here I think is the point. To assume that science can say something about the supernatural, I think is problematic. So what you were describing in terms of pieces of the cross, I'm not quite sure how that points to the fact that God can't exist outside of time and space and make himself manifest in time and space through Jesus Christ. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well,
I got so much.
I mean, if you accept that language as significant in the sense that it signifies or refers to something, yes, but God, I would question that to begin with. I realize that traditionally it has been accepted. Theologians speak this way all the time. I guess I'm an outsider who says, I'm not sure you guys really know what you're talking about, regardless of how sophisticated you are, and regardless of what a rich tradition comes before you're saying something about the transcendent God who exists out of time. One of my professors at UC Irvine, Nelson Pike, wrote a book, God and Timelessness. And basically he's arguing that to the extent that God is eternal, he's eternal not in the sense of everlasting, but in the sense of existing out of time. And I suppose he made some sense in that book. I didn't read it. I had trouble with it. I mean, it's kind of like saying 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of when you say it. Time predicates do not apply to the truth 2 + 2 = 4. That's all it comes to. It's timeless. Is that all you're saying about God? Temporal predicates do not apply to this entity, given that this entity exists?
Yeah, that is a can of worms. That is a topic for another day, one I'm very interested in. Right? Now, what I do want to come back to, again, that's not the point that I was trying to make. It's that science itself, if it has this methodological naturalism that points to what is material and says this is what's going on in the material, then we shouldn't expect it to say something toward that which is not material.
There's another way to phrase that.
If there is anything that is not material.
There's another way to phrase that.
Okay, but see, now we're at the question.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
There's
The question is
another way to
valid.
phrase that. It's science can't say anything about the supernatural. Science can't say anything about that which doesn't exist either.
Right.
Science can't measure that which doesn't exist.
Sure.
And that which doesn't exist weighs and feels and smells exactly the same as that which doesn't exist, right?
Okay, sorry,
It's kind of like saying...
Sorry, go ahead.
It's kind of like saying science has nothing to do with fiction. I mean, you dream up a story, okay? Walt Disney dreams up his characters, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and interactions between all these characters. And then what do you say? Science cannot tell us anything about what Mickey Mouse has to do with Minnie Mouse or Donald Duck has to do with the 3 nephews. Okay.
It's a category error.
But that's, so what?
Yes, so you're equating Christianity with Donald Duck.
No, not necessarily.
That's inflammatory.
It's an analogy.
Yeah,
It's an analogy. It's an analogy. And you are assuming that there's a certain realm out there which, if science covered every possible realm to be covered, no. You're saying no. I'm sorry. That's wrong. What you're saying is there's a lot out there which is not material, including fictional, I would say, which science does not cover. And I say, okay, so what?
So you stop. You can't go further than that then because you don't know.
We can only measure what we can account
Yeah.
for.
But see, this is assuming that the only real knowledge is scientific knowledge. And that's an assumption I would challenge.
No.
Because I think that, if we're going to talk about philosophy, that is conceptual, which is other than material.
But that's false. We're not assuming that. I know a lot of things which are not scientific knowledge. I mean, just the basic things I know from everyday living, right? I know how to get home from here. Is that scientific knowledge?
Well,
That's not scientific.
what I was trying to get at is you drew the distinction that science has nothing to say with fiction. Okay? So the assumption was that there are ways of knowing that are other than scientific.
Experience, perception, interaction.
There are ways of knowing that other than scientific. My question there is, and how do you know you're correct once you get there?
How do you know? Well,
I mean, because you can follow logic. I see this as sort of like going through a maze. You can follow a logic to go from one step to the next, And to me, you can end up in essentially a dark room with no doors. You're at a conclusion that you have reached using tools of philosophy and logic, but you don't know if that's meaningful or.
Right. Well, this is where I would come back to skills in living. Okay, so we talked about philosophy being loving wisdom. So any concept that is true or getting us closer to truth ought to be able to be lived out and guide life effectively.
Guide life effectively.
So if we're going to talk about philosophy, so there's,
Okay. So now, but now you're getting into subjectives of what's effective, what is desirable.
Sure. Well, again, this is
So-
a long history of
Yeah.
human nature. So what I'm saying is that there are ways of determining better concepts from worse concepts. Better philosophy than worse philosophy. Regressive or progressive. There are ways of discerning that. And usually it does show up in how to live life. So it is not that they can be radically separated, the material world from a transcendent world. Okay? Again, yes, I understand I'm assuming certain things here that you wouldn't share, which is okay. But what I'm trying to say is answer the question. So how do I know that I'm not going to end up in a dark room somewhere? Well, because any philosophy worth its salt ought to be able to guide how I live. So any concepts worth having ought to inform day-to-day life.
Then that's a presupposition.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Which I'm okay with that. I think everybody.
And I'm
begins
not
with it.
saying transcendence doesn't exist. I'm saying it exists in the same way love and music exist. They are concepts. Transcendence is a concept that we make up to explain things we can't explain. This is the classic human. Oh, what are the twinkling lights in the sky? Where do they go when the sun goes? Why is this? Why is there something rather than nothing? When we don't know something, we make up things because the human brain. I don't need to tell you about all the biases about the human brain. It's constantly playing tricks on itself. We'd rather have bad answers than no answers, right? But I'm not saying dogmatically that transcendence doesn't exist. I'm saying it exists in the same way that all concepts exist. They exist independent of the mind, or dependent upon the mind, which is the function of the brain.
Yes. So that's a question for another day. So it sounds like you're trying to.
If we can weigh your transcendence, if you can demonstrate it to me, the Wendy's commercial, show me the beef.
Yeah. See, this
Right?
is where I think you're confusing those two types of.
Please fix my confusion.
No, I think you're trying to use science to apply to something that can't be determined by science.
All things that don't exist can't be determined by
Yeah,
science.
see that, but see, I would not share that assumption.
So science can say things about things that don't exist?
No, that there are things that exist that science cannot necessarily speak to.
There are things there are questions we can't answer.
There might be.
Sure,
things
we have
that
to
science
allow
can
for
say nothing
possibility.
to. Yes,
But
yes.
the problem is that saying, oh, we have to allow for the possibility, allows anything to fit in that space.
Right.
You can fit in.
It's true.
Well, let's just go on the assumption that Allah and Jehovah are different gods. You can fit in Allah in there. You can fit in Vishnu in there. You can fit in anybody.
Yes.
It doesn't point. It's a deist argument. It's not a theist argument.
But just because you can fit anything in there doesn't mean nothing actually fits there.
Correct.
Okay. So at that point, we're in a whole other conversation.
Or you could be making a category error and asking what the color of 7 is. 7s don't have colors,
Yes,
right?
or
7 is a number, right?
Or
It
this
could be a
is where-
category error too.
And this is where I say you're committing that categorical error.
Well, I'm lobbing that at
So
you
try-
in a friendly manner.
Yes.
I'm lobbing that at you, and I'm saying there could be a category error that you're making by the assumption that transcendence does exist and science can't say anything about it.
And I'm saying that you are likewise, in
Fair-
a friendly
fair-
way,
fair.
committing that categorical error.
Fair.
I think trying to apply science to that which is not scientific.
Fair. We try this ground.
Can I go back to, you said that philosophy has a role in science?
Hmm?
Explain that again.
Okay. So it's the underpinnings. Okay. So if we come back to this statement by these scientists, said the answer is simply this: there's no escape from philosophy. Every scientist takes a philosophical position, either tacitly or explicitly, whenever they state that a result is important or fundamental or interesting.
So okay, so we don't go over the same ground. So you're taking us back to the scientific presupposition then. If there is something to be determined that we don't know, and we're trying to determine the truth of it, is there a difference in when we use philosophy and when we use science? So going back to the role of philosophy here,
Yeah.
what's the proper tool for the job, and what are the limits of these tools?
Right. So the conceptual analysis All right, so one more time, I want to make sure I'm answering the right question. So tell me the question again.
Okay, I've got this little silly experiment or demonstration I want to try, and we'll see if it helps. We'll stay away from transcendence probably. So we'll see. There is a box in the next room.
Okay.
Okay. Is there something in the box, is my question. So what does philosophy, how can you apply philosophy to that question? And then we'll ask you how science can answer that question.
I think the philosopher would probably get up and walk into the next room and open the box.
That would be doing science. That would be doing science.
See, this is where you're accepting a hard and fast distinction between
It's
those.
a priori science. It's conceptual. It's argumentative conceptually only.
So that's why I see philosophy as basically thought experiment. So can you apply thought to that
See,
problem?
I would not define science in that way.
No, philosophy.
Excuse me, I would not define, that's what I meant. I would not define philosophy in that way.
Okay, that's fine. I mean,
Philosophy
so
is
then,
always tied to skills in living. And so if a philosophy is worth its salt, it will show up in a better way of living.
that's really specific.
Could
so,
I,
so there's values and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, which are all involved with that.
Todd,
So it's not really used to determine the truth of things. It's used to determine when it's sort of functionally valuable.
Now, again, functionally valuable is certainly part of that. Remember when I talked about pragmatism, okay, and negative pragmatism. So pragmatism, something is true because it works. Negative pragmatism is if it is true.
That doesn't make it true. It makes it valuable.
Right. Now, what do you mean by true?
Utilitarian.
True or false? Is there something in that box?
Right. Okay. Well, again, if I walk up and go into the room and open it up and look at it, say, well, no, it's empty. Then I.
But then you're not doing philosophy. You're doing science.
I don't think that is right. I mean, I would not. Now, if I said that this empty box is not valuable, then we're in the domain of philosophy.
That's
Robert,
opinion, though.
can you go into the next room? There's a black box on the counter. Bring it in. Don't say anything. Carry it with 2 hands, please, and put it down on the table.
In the meantime, can Juan ask a question?
Yeah.
yeah, could I interrupt? You define philosophy as always involved with skill in living or promoting skill in living?
Yeah, so if it's a love of wisdom, wisdom is usually understood as something like skills in living.
So everyone who's been called a philosopher who's done philosophical work, you would say has to fall under that category.
Well, they're in pursuit of it. This is when we love it, don't possess
There's
it.
a whole school of analytical philosophers who, one would be hard pressed, one would have to twist and turn to see their work as somehow promoting skill in living. For example, Wittgenstein, whether the early or the later. Even Bertrand Russell, I mean, some of his writings later on, when he got into more informal writing, you could probably classify as dealing with skill in living to a certain extent. But let's talk about his mathematical work, his work in the Principia Mathematica along with Whitehead. In what sense is that philosophical work promoting skill in living?
Well, if you take a look at a lot of Plato's works, they involve a great deal of mathematics. Okay? Now, so both of them talk about mathematics, but it's trying to get us at ways of understanding what is good and what is true.
Maybe with Plato, but I don't think that's true with Whitehead and Russell.
I think inevitably you would push it and it would come back to this is a better way of understanding
Oh,
life.
you'd have to do some kind of interpretation and...
Well, of course. I mean, all philosophy is interpretation. In a way.
Yeah. But from that it follows that you can see or interpret anyone's philosophical work as following this definition you threw out there. And I just think it's false. I don't think half the philosophers who've done impressive work were doing that.
Yes. Well, I think analytic philosophy does shy away from it. But if you ask them, I work with several analytic philosophers, and if you ask them, they will say, yes, we're dealing with these puzzles, we're dealing with paradoxes, but always to give us a better understanding of what is real, of what is true, so that we may live more effectively.
Oh, Well, okay, maybe some of them do, but I could probably produce as many who don't. And they were awfully darn good analytical philosophers.
Can I want you to do your spare, but I want to get a quick question in. And Todd,
Yeah,
you're being
go
such
ahead.
a great sport. You're burning so much fuel with us. I really appreciate it. But before we were talking about the nature of consciousness and transcendence, and specifically, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's almost like a Cartesian dualist. Yes? No. Okay. I'll let you put words in your own mouth. But what I want to ask is one of my favorite points to make.
I put my foot in there a lot too, so there's room.
We're going to need to see that on camera to verify. Epistemology requires a.
I can do that. I can do that in Photoshop too.
What I want to know from you is based upon your assumption that I may or may not be giving you fairly. If consciousness is independent of material, yes, why is it that drugs alter your consciousness?
Well, I would not pick up that. I don't want to argue that consciousness is separable from material. Okay? I was using that as an argumentative point to show that there may be things that transcend what science can get at. Okay? So, yes, I'm currently wrestling through proper ways to understand. I'm not a substance dualist. I would say I'm a recuperating substance dualist. Okay, so but that doesn't
good luck on your recovery.
Well, that doesn't mean that I'm going to default to this. I just think there's a
It's not a false dichotomy because it doesn't
right. Well, psychosomatic unity is sometimes how it's called, a body-soul unity.
Sure.
So a dual aspect monism, okay, to neuroscience. So I was using it actually as an argumentative point rather than trying to argue for.
Okay. The specifics itself are not
Right,
important related to. Okay, fair.
What I'm trying to get at, again, the bottom line is that there is things to be known that science doesn't get at.
I was just curious about that one point to push specifically,
Sure, okay.
but I feel you kind of taking a little bit of that line back.
Well,
On that specifically.
Well, I used it
consciousness.
for a purpose. Okay, but that is an argumentative purpose, not necessarily a
Rhetorical.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me finish this because it's, I don't know, maybe it'll turn out to be silly and then we'll get one or two questions. We're running a little long. So I like to find the fringes of things, where the borders. So, and it may not be that philosophy is the proper tool here. So if that's the case, then that's okay. Then that's an edge that we've just defined. So again, there's the box now. We can see it. It's no longer a thought experiment. Is there something in the box, not counting air? It's no trick question.
It's not
a trick question.
Or is it?
It's Schrodinger's cat.
Can philosophy be applied to that question? Does philosophy have any utility in answering that question?
Well, I would assume that yes, it does.
And how?
I'll agree.
Well, to reflect.
Give me an example.
Okay, so what was the question again?
Is there something in the box?
Is there something in the box? All right, so you have two possibilities. Say yes or no. Okay, and you get into probability theory. Okay, so here is where philosophy actually can help you think, all right, there may be or there may not be.
And you base the probabilities on?
Probability theory.
Okay, I agree. I actually agree. I agree. I don't think you can go very far with it.
Right.
Which is kind of what I was.
I mean, ultimately,
getting at before.
Philosophers have to live in the real world of life and space and time. And so this is where functionally life is a laboratory of science. Or life is a laboratory of philosophy.
Am I correct in saying that this becomes something you can speculate on, but you really can't really get to whether or not you can't get to an answer. You can speculate toward the answer and work with probabilities.
Right.
But then that's the role of philosophy in this question. What would science do with this question?
Well,
Is there something in the box?
I get to be the sole arbiter of science.
Yeah.
Thank you, all of you who have spent your entire lives in the laboratory doing peer review. I'm not a scientist. I am an operational scientist. When I look at the box, I agree. It's a dichotomy. It either contains something or it contains nothing, and we're excluding air and a quantum vacuum and so forth, right?
Yeah.
What I can say about it is, I do know certain things about the nature of matter and the nature of material and time and the time-space continuum and what can occupy a finite space here. And I can look at it and I say, well, I know it can't be a Toyota, right?
Well, I'm not asking you what it is. I'm asking you, is there something in the box?
And I don't know.
I'm not asking you what's in the
I don't
box.
know, and I would be remiss to speculate.
Okay, well,
And
See, you're not, I think you were just doing philosophy.
I am, but I don't know. But
the car is not in that.
But I'm doing something. Well, this is my point though, because I know a certain thing about the size of this, about the volume, that what would fit in there and would not fit in there. A Toyota Land Cruiser would not, but a toy Yoda, the character from Star Wars, 6 or 7 inches, might fit in there, right? So I know that I can rule out a certain number of possibilities, and we're talking about probability theory, right? But to be the sole arbiter of science, I would have to pick it up and inspect and examine it myself and perform experiments.
So there you go. So do an experiment. You have the ability to do an experiment.
If there's something nasty in here, Phil, you and I are not going to be friends.
Do not open
anymore.
it. Do not open it.
Oh, sorry.
Toyota.
Do an experiment.
So I'm noticing it's
What's
got
your
it's got a
experiment?
certain mass and weight to it. I don't hear any tonal. There's something I can't tell.
Okay, so put it back
That's the best
down.
I can weigh it. I can measure it. I can.
Is there something in the box? Give me your best judgment.
Yes, I'm going to say it's got about the mass and weight and the consistency of a receipt from Target with no more than 3 items on it.
I didn't hear anything rattle. Did you hear something rattle?
I wanted to shake it more, but you stopped me. So I was respecting the parameters of the experiment.
And by the way, thank you for doing philosophy first. Okay, let's take you in 2 situations real quick. It's the year 1600. You just did that experiment.
Okay.
That was what was available to you was,
Sure.
basically weight and shaking and lifting it and stuff. Now it's the year 2017. What can you do? What additional tools do you have to make that evaluation, to make what additional experiments?
I can use an X-ray machine.
There you go. Okay, so in the year 1600, and I will show you what is in the box. There is something in the box. It is a piece of tape.
It's about the matter, weight, consistency of a Target receipt with no more than 3 items on it, isn't
Now,
it?
in this particular thing, philosophy fails because it can speculate, but it can't go beyond the speculation. Science, with limited experimentation, can be wrong, right?
But I'm bringing my biases to the experiment, Bill.
Well, I'm not going there. Don't trust me. I'm not going there. But it could also be corrected with additional information and additional tools. So that's what I see as sort of a difference in the range of usage. I see the philosophy as the speculative piece, and the science as the experimental piece. So.
But then there's top-down and bottom-up philosophy. Now I can, once
Yeah,
I
that's-
run the
that's a
experiment,
different thing. We can
and
get
I know
into-
what's in it, I can say, is it Scotch tape, is it masking tape, is it duct tape? I can learn more respective of what I know, right? Top-down
Yeah.
philosophy, instead I can philosophize further,
Yeah.
right? So there's still a role in philosophy, I would agree,
Yeah.
once we have the knowledge. But if you're continuing to philosophize about things that we already know, you are doing what I call regressive philosophy.
Yeah. If you
Just to
want
tie it all back into a big
regressive
bow.
philosophy would be if we start to do some sort of apologetics on why it's actually not there. Or
I think
not tape, but-
philosophy is genuine introspective. It's genuine truth seeking. The word truth I'll push back on, but I'll use it for colloquialism. Philosophy is genuine truth seeking. Apologetics is defending regardless of accuracy. You don't care if it's right or wrong. You're going to defend it.
Okay. Well,
the
then,
depth.
let me. I'll take that word back.
And we didn't do apologetics today. We did
Yeah,
philosophy.
a whole nother day. Okay, we're running over, so I'm gonna drop it right there or stop it right there. And thank you guys. We'll do a couple of questions in a minute. Let's take a break first, and thank you guys very much.